For 119 days, the M1A3 tank sat dead in the middle of Fort Lawson like a cursed steel monster. The military had burned through $2 million, brought in 50 engineers, and replaced 3 control systems, yet the machine refused to move. Just as the brass prepared to sign the order canceling the entire project, Mason Reed, a quiet single father working as a civilian mechanic, walked into the hangar. Officers laughed at his oil-stained boots and his battered toolbox. But 10 minutes later, the general shot up from his chair, stunned into silence. The morning at Fort Lawson arrived cold and gray, wind cutting across the wide testing yard where the M1A3 sat motionless beneath the hangar lights. The machine looked less like a vehicle and more like a sleeping predator, its hull dulled by frost, its turret frozen in place as if waiting for an order it would never obey. This prototype was no ordinary tank. It had been built as a glimpse into the future of armored warfare, packed with an electronic control suite, reactive armor plating, thermal sensors, a semi-automatic drivetrain, and stabilization software meant to keep its main gun locked on target even across broken terrain. The military had poured years of research into this single machine, and everyone understood the stakes. If it succeeded, it would become the new symbol of American engineering. If it failed, it would become a defense scandal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The trouble was simple to describe and impossible to fix. The tank would start. Every display turned green. Electrical signals flowed exactly as they should, but the moment the crew shifted it into drive mode, the auxiliary engine cut out, the transmission locked solid, the turret drifted 3 degrees off-center, and the entire system shut itself down without warning or explanation. Across 119 days, more than 50 engineers had thrown everything they had at the problem. They replaced the central control module. They swapped the hydraulic pressure sensors. They rewrote and updated the firmware twice. They pulled the transmission apart and rebuilt it from scratch. They changed the main wiring harness. They inspected the fuel tank, the cooling system, every filter, every thermal sensor along the hull. The total cost climbed past $2 million, and still nobody could point to the actual cause. General Logan Hayes received calls from the Pentagon every single day, each one shorter and colder than the last. He was a man running out of room to maneuver, caught between a program that refused to die and superiors who demanded either a fix or a funeral. Diana Carter, the lead engineer on the project, was the most devoted person on the base. She slept in her office more nights than not, ate standing up in the hangar, and pored over blueprints until her eyes blurred. Yet even she had begun to suspect that the failure was not a single broken part, but something far harder to name. Connor Blake, representing the defense contractor that built the tank, pushed hard for a different conclusion. He wanted the Army to sign a report stating that the failure belonged to the base maintenance crew, a clean way to protect his company and its enormous contract. The air inside the hangar had grown taut as a wire. Engineers in pressed uniforms stood around with tablets in hand, staring at the tank as though it were already a lost cause, already a line item to be written off. Some of the engineers had stopped meeting each other's eyes weeks ago, tired of pretending the next theory would be the one that finally worked. The hangar smelled of cold metal, spent coffee, and the faint bitterness of diesel that never seemed to wash out of anyone's hands anymore. Reporters had not yet caught wind of the failure, but everyone in that room understood it was only a matter of time before a story this expensive found its way into the wrong inbox. Just as General Hayes prepared to sign the order freezing the program for good, old Sergeant Joseph Miller spoke up, mentioning a name nobody in that polished room recognized. Mason Reed, he said, a civilian mechanic who had a habit of fixing machines that nobody else could understand. Connor Blake let out a short, dismissive laugh, saying this was a cutting-edge combat vehicle, not some rusted truck pulled out of a junkyard. General Hayes, with no better option left on the table, agreed to bring the man in, though only as one final, almost ceremonial attempt before the project was declared dead for good. Mason Reed did not arrive with any fanfare. He pulled up in an old pickup truck with rust along the wheel wells, wearing a charcoal work jacket, dark canvas pants, and boots stained dark with engine oil. He carried a battered toolbox that looked older than most of the engineers standing in the hangar. He looked nothing like the kind of expert anyone in that room expected. No suit, no badge of rank, no tablet computer, no team of assistants trailing behind him. A few of the younger engineers exchanged glances of open contempt, the kind reserved for someone who did not belong in a room full of degrees and clearances. Connor Blake made a point of asking, loudly enough for everyone to hear, who exactly had given a truck mechanic clearance to walk into a classified weapons facility. Mason did not answer the jab. He simply asked to see the failure logs, the maintenance diagrams, the list of every part that had already been replaced, and the recorded footage of each failed startup attempt. Diana Carter watched him with quiet suspicion at first. She did not dislike him, but bringing a civilian mechanic into a top-secret program felt to her like an act of pure desperation, a final gesture before surrender. General Hayes laid out the terms plainly. Mason would have 30 minutes to observe, and he was not permitted to touch the vehicle until cleared to do so. The hangar lights buzzed faintly overhead, and somewhere near the back wall a space heater clicked uselessly against the chill rolling off the open bay doors. Mason walked a slow circle around the tank, and notably he did not start with the instrument panel the way every other engineer had. He started by listening. When the technical crew ran another startup attempt, every eye in the room fixed on the control display. Mason crouched low near the steel floor instead, his ear close to the deck, focused on a faint vibration coming from the transmission housing. He noticed something the others had missed entirely. The cutoff sound was not originating from the transmission receiving its command. It was happening a fraction of a second before that command ever arrived. Then Mason asked a question that silenced the entire room. He wanted to know who had replaced the left side wiring bundle but kept the old-style connector clamp in place. Diana froze because the question was far too specific to be a guess, and that particular detail had never appeared in any official report. Connor immediately cut in, insisting the data was irrelevant to the conversation. Mason kept going. He asked about the first 3 failed tests, the ones recorded before the central control module was ever swapped out, wanting to know if that original failure matched the pattern they were seeing now. Aidan Brooks, the youngest engineer on the team, dug back through the archived footage and discovered something striking. The original failure looked nothing like the current one. This meant that somewhere during the long chain of repairs, someone had either made the underlying problem worse, or had deliberately steered the investigation in the wrong direction. Mason remained calm through all of it. He told the room that the tank had not died from one massive failure. It had died from a stack of smaller failures arranged in a way that resembled a single catastrophic one. Connor laughed loudly at that, calling it nothing more than a mechanic's guesswork. Mason did not raise his voice. He simply turned to General Hayes and said that if he were allowed to remove one side access panel, he could prove his theory within 10 minutes. A long silence followed, the kind that settles over a room once everyone realizes a decision is about to be made that cannot easily be undone. Diana found herself studying Mason's face, searching for arrogance or bravado and finding neither. Only a steady, unhurried certainty that unsettled her more than any confident speech could have. General Hayes hesitated, mindful of the security protocols wrapped around the prototype, but he eventually allowed Mason to inspect the panel under Diana's direct supervision. Mason did not call for any advanced equipment. He worked with a small flashlight, an oil-stained rag, and an old screwdriver pulled from his own toolbox. A few people in the hangar could not suppress their laughter. One engineer muttered that $2 million of diagnostic equipment had already failed to solve this, and now a man intended to fix it with a screwdriver. Mason ignored the remark entirely, the way he had learned to ignore most jabs over the years, letting the noise pass through him without leaving a mark. He removed the side panel without disturbing the main systems behind it, running his fingers carefully along the wiring bundle, checking the clamp, the insulation layer, and catching a faint trace of a burnt smell. He found it almost immediately, a tiny scuff mark along the signal wiring, positioned in a spot that would only make contact at one very specific angle of vibration through the hull. That flaw was sending a false signal to the turret stability sensor, convincing the system that the turret was losing balance. In response, the safety system automatically locked the drivetrain to prevent the tank from firing while unstable during movement. But Mason was not finished. He pointed out that the scuff mark did not resemble ordinary wear and tear. It looked instead like a thin, deliberate cut made by a narrow tool. Diana bent down to examine it herself and immediately recognized something deeply wrong. This wiring bundle did not appear anywhere on the official parts replacement list. Mason asked for the simulated vibration test to be activated. Diana ran the simulation herself. The moment the artificial vibration reached a level matching rocky terrain, the same false error signal appeared on the display exactly as predicted. The hangar fell completely silent. General Hayes rose from his seat the instant he saw the error code match every prior failure on record. Mason laid it out plainly for the room. The main engine was not broken. The transmission was not broken. The central control module was not broken. The actual failure was a false signal tricking the protective system into shutting itself down for no real reason. Connor Blake's face drained of color, though he still tried to argue that this was merely a secondary issue. Mason replied that a secondary issue could not possibly cost 119 days if the technical reports had been honest from the very beginning. Diana began to see Mason in an entirely different light. He was clearly not just a mechanic. He understood mechanical systems, electronic behavior, and the real-world conduct of armored vehicles under battlefield stress all at once. General Hayes asked Mason how long the actual repair would take. Mason answered with care. A temporary fix to get the tank running for a test would take about 40 minutes. A proper repair, done to full standard, would require checking the entire wiring run, every clamp, and the full parts history log. His answer was humble and exact at the same time, free of showmanship, yet precise enough to make everyone in that hangar realize they had spent 119 days looking in the wrong direction entirely. Joseph Miller, standing near the back wall, allowed himself the smallest of smiles, the kind a man wears when a long-held suspicion is finally proven right. He had vouched for Mason on instinct alone, and watching the room reorganize itself around a man it had mocked only minutes earlier felt, to him, like a small and quiet justice. While Mason worked on the temporary repair to the signal wiring, Diana quietly pulled up his personnel file. On paper, it looked unremarkable. Mason Reed, civilian contract mechanic, previous work at vehicle restoration shops handling old military equipment, certified in diesel maintenance and hydraulic systems. But Diana noticed a gap of 7 years sitting in the middle of his work history. No listed company, no listed unit, no description of duties at all, just a blank stretch where a career should have been. Joseph Miller leaned in and quietly told Diana that Mason had once been called to places nobody liked to name out loud. He had fixed equipment in the middle of deserts, in the middle of active conflict zones, under pressure where lives hung on whether a machine started or not. Mason had once served as a field technician attached to a specialized support unit, the kind tasked with keeping armored vehicles running in places where replacement parts simply did not exist. He had walked away from that life after an incident he rarely spoke about, choosing instead a quiet existence built around raising his daughter. There were nights, Joseph said carefully, when Mason still woke before dawn out of old habit, listening for sounds that were no longer there. The details about his family stayed deliberately thin. He had a daughter named Grace. He once took a short call from her babysitter in the middle of a shift. He told the caller softly that he would be home a little late, but that everything was fine. No child ever appeared directly in any scene. Being a single father meant Mason always needed steady, dependable work, yet he was constantly underestimated because he carried no impressive degree, no polished title to wave around. Diana began to understand why he never reacted to the mockery aimed his way. He had long since grown used to being measured by his appearance rather than his ability, and he had stopped needing to prove himself with words. Meanwhile, Connor Blake made a quiet phone call of his own, ordering someone on his end to retrieve every old inspections record before the Army could dig any deeper. Connor was afraid, because if Mason kept pulling at threads, his company's massive contract would collapse entirely. Mason finished the temporary repair without any announcement of victory. He simply asked everyone to stand clear of the tank, because if his analysis was correct, the machine was about to move under its own power for the first time in 119 days. Diana took her position at the control station. General Hayes stood behind the protective glass. Connor stared fixedly ahead, sweat beginning to form along his hairline. The engine roared to life. For the first time in nearly 4 months, the M1A3 rolled forward, clearing the painted red line on the hangar floor. The entire hangar erupted in stunned celebration, voices overlapping, someone clapping Joseph on the shoulder, a young technician laughing in pure disbelief. But the joy lasted only a few seconds. Mason caught a second sound rising from deep inside the hull, heavier and far more dangerous than the first. He raised his hand immediately, signaling everyone to stop. Everyone assumed Mason had already finished the job, but Mason insisted the tank had only just escaped its first trap. He had heard a shift in load coming from the turret stabilization cluster and warned that if the test continued at higher speed, the system might lock the main gun into the wrong position or damage the entire turret ring. Connor, irritated, accused Mason of dragging the process out simply to look important. Mason calmly asked for the stabilization cluster's seal tag to be checked. Diana inspected it and discovered the tag had clearly been peeled back and reapplied at some point. This detail mattered a great deal because the stabilization cluster was a component supplied directly by Connor's company, and it was supposed to remain sealed before delivery to the Army. Mason pointed to 3 specific signs drawn from years of hands-on experience. The lubricant inside was the wrong shade compared to the standard specification. One bolt showed a crooked, uneven torque mark. The serial code stamped on the housing did not fully match the code listed in the official documentation. Diana cross-checked the records and discovered that this exact component belonged to a test batch that had already been rejected for overheating. Connor tried to seize the documents back, but General Hayes ordered every file locked down immediately. What had started as a simple repair effort suddenly turned into a suspicion of outright defense fraud. Mason laid out the logic without raising his voice. If the tank failed publicly, the contractor could blame the Army for mishandling it. If the Army signed off on canceling the program, they would be forced to purchase an entirely new upgrade package from that very same company. The $2 million already spent on repairs was nothing compared to the value of the contract waiting behind door number 2. Diana felt sick realizing how thoroughly she had been used. For 119 days she had worked herself to exhaustion, basing every decision on data that had been quietly twisted from the start. She thought of every sleepless night spent hunched over blueprints that had never told her the full truth, and the realization settled in her stomach like a stone. General Hayes asked Mason to help inspect the entire system before an emergency hearing with Army inspectors scheduled for the following morning. Mason initially refused, saying he had no real authority here and had no wish to be dragged into a political fight that was not his to fight. Diana told him plainly that if he walked away now, they might never be able to prove any of it. Mason looked at the tank, then at the buried documents spread across the table. He thought of the soldiers who might one day have to operate a flawed machine like this one out on an actual battlefield. He agreed to stay, but set one condition. Every discovery from this point forward had to be filmed, sealed, and sent directly to General Hayes, bypassing Connor entirely. General Hayes agreed without hesitation. The long investigation began that night. Mason, Diana, Joseph, and Aiden became the only small group still working inside the hangar. Outside, sleet fell steadily against the metal roof. Inside, they pulled back panel after panel, checking every wire run, every hydraulic line, every update log line by line. Near the end of that stretch, Mason uncovered something that sent a chill through the entire group. This tank had not simply malfunctioned by accident. It had been fitted deliberately with a failure mechanism that only triggered under very specific conditions. Outside, the sleet had turned to a thin, steady snow, and for a long moment nobody in that hangar spoke at all. Mason discovered that the conditional failure mechanism only activated when 3 factors occurred together at the same time. The hull had to vibrate at a level matching real combat terrain. The turret had to rotate past a certain angle. The drivetrain had to shift into a heavy load state simultaneously. When all 3 conditions lined up, the tank would lock itself solid, yet the recorded data would log the event as an ordinary operator error rather than a genuine mechanical defect. This meant the flaw rarely appeared during a calm laboratory test. Out on a real battlefield, though, it could easily trap an entire crew inside a dead machine. Diana's voice shook as she understood the full weight of it. If this prototype had been approved as it stood, soldiers could die because of a flaw that had been deliberately hidden from view. She pressed a hand against the cold steel hull as if to steady herself, picturing a crew somewhere overseas trusting this very machine with their lives. Aiden checked the software logs and found that large sections of data had been deleted outright. Joseph dug through an old paper printout buried in the maintenance archive, revealing that a technician had once flagged a batch of overheating components, a warning that had never reached Diana's desk. Connor showed up in the middle of the night with 2 security contractors, demanding that everyone stop immediately, claiming a violation of contractor confidentiality terms. General Hayes arrived just as quickly, standing directly against Connor, ordering military security to secure the hangar without delay. Connor shifted his attack toward Mason personally, insisting that an unlicensed mechanic had no business touching a classified prototype and could be contaminating the evidence with every move he made. Mason did not argue back. He simply laid out in plain view of everyone present a severed wire, a mismatched component, and a printed log showing the simulated false failure. Diana stepped forward to defend Mason without hesitation. This marked the turning point in their relationship. Where she had once doubted him on sight, she now openly admitted that Mason was the only person in the entire investigation who had correctly understood the true nature of the problem from the start. Connor threatened Diana's career, warning that she would face a lawsuit if she kept slandering the contractor. Diana answered that she would rather lose her entire career than sign off on a tank capable of killing American soldiers. Mason found something else buried inside the latest software update, a hidden technical signature that did not belong to Diana's team at all. It traced back instead to Connor's own testing division. Aiden managed to recover a fragment of an internal email referencing a plan to leave the flaw untouched until the upgrade package received final approval. Connor lost his composure and tried to leave the hangar. General Hayes ordered him held in place until Army inspectors could arrive. Yet Connor still held one final card. A formal demonstration in front of Pentagon representatives was scheduled for the very next morning, and if the tank failed to perform flawlessly, the entire program would still be canceled, while every piece of evidence collected tonight could be argued over for months to come. Mason understood that proving fraud was not enough on its own. They needed the tank to perform cleanly and completely in front of everyone watching. He looked around at the small, exhausted group still standing in the hangar at that late hour, and felt for the first time in years that he was exactly where he needed to be. The morning broke over Fort Lawson with a thin layer of frost covering the testing yard. Pentagon representatives, Army inspectors, the full technical team, and the contractor delegation all stood waiting in the cold morning light, their breath visible in pale clouds as they shifted from foot to foot, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Connor tried to seize back control of the narrative, claiming that Mason had interfered with the system without authorization, rendering the entire test invalid before it even began. General Hayes responded firmly that every single action Mason had taken was on record, filmed under direct military supervision from start to finish. Diana presented the findings clearly to the gathered officials. A false signal triggering a phantom failure, a mismatched component pulled from a rejected batch, deleted data hidden from her own engineering team, a conditional failure mechanism built to hide itself during routine testing. Connor pushed back again, dismissing the entire presentation as speculation dressed up as fact. The lead inspector called for a live demonstration on the spot. If Mason's analysis held up, the tank would need to survive a full combat terrain simulation immediately following the temporary repair and isolation of the flaw. Mason had no interest in placing himself at the center of attention. He suggested that Diana should be the one behind the controls, since she remained the rightful lead engineer on this entire program. Diana felt a wave of gratitude mixed with nerves. Mason walked her through every detail she needed to watch for. Avoid pushing the load too hard too early. Keep the turret rotating exactly within the test parameters. Track the secondary signal drift instead of staring only at the primary warning light. The M1A3 rolled out onto the open testing field, its engine roaring after 119 days of total silence. The test unfolded in stages. Crossing a dry trench, climbing a rocky slope, rotating the turret while still in motion, shifting suddenly into a heavy load condition. Everyone held their breath as the tank reached the exact combination of conditions that had once killed it instantly. This time, the system did not lock. The tank kept moving, the turret stayed steady, and the hull cleared the difficult stretch of terrain without a single hesitation. Applause began to ripple through the crowd, yet Mason still was not satisfied. He studied the data feed closely and noticed one secondary signal line still flickering slightly. He signaled for the test to pause before the final stage was complete. Connor laughed immediately, declaring that Mason had just failed in front of everyone who mattered. Mason walked calmly to the large display screen and pointed out that this flickering line was, in fact, the final piece of proof they needed. The signal was not coming from the tank at all. It was coming from a small override device plugged directly into the contractor's own testing rig. Aiden examined the device and confirmed that it had been engineered specifically to inject interference into a live test whenever it was needed. This time, Connor had no remaining argument left to hide behind. The crowd that had been ready to applaud only minutes earlier now watched in stunned silence as the true shape of the morning revealed itself. The lead Army inspector ordered every piece of contractor equipment seized on the spot. Connor tried to claim he had only followed instructions from higher up, but General Hayes ordered him to stay silent until military council arrived. The morning that had begun with frost on the testing yard now felt charged with something closer to disbelief, every officer present recalculating how much they had nearly signed away. Recovered data revealed that Connor's company had known about the defective component long before this entire ordeal began. They never reported it because doing so would have forced a complete recall of an entire production batch along with steep financial penalties. Instead, they let the flaw remain hidden, allowing the Army to believe the prototype needed an entirely new upgrade package worth $800 million. Mason raised a point that mattered even more than the fraud itself. The overall tank design was not fundamentally flawed. There was no need to cancel the program. They simply needed to replace the protective wiring run, swap in a properly certified stabilization cluster, and remove the override device entirely. This single insight saved the entire program from being scrapped. Diana stood before the gathered officials and admitted openly that she had overlooked certain warning signs because she had trusted the contractor's data too completely. Mason refused to let her carry that blame alone. He told her that a good engineer was not someone who had never been deceived, but someone willing to look again the moment the truth surfaced. That single sentence earned Mason a deep and lasting respect from Diana. General Hayes asked Mason how he had managed to spot the flaw so quickly. Mason offered a brief account of an old mission, describing an armored vehicle that had once failed in almost the same way out in a conflict zone. The electronic report told one story, while the actual sound coming from the hull told another entirely. Mason had learned long ago that machinery never lies, even when the data describing it has been falsified. He kept the wartime details brief, just enough to add weight without dwelling on the past. The inspector asked why someone with this much experience was working as a small contract mechanic. Mason answered simply that he was not chasing a title. He needed work close enough to home so he could be there for his family. The mention of his daughter stayed brief, a single line about needing to be present whenever Grace needed him, with no scene ever showing her directly. General Hayes realized the Army had nearly overlooked a remarkable talent simply because they judged him by credentials and appearance instead of ability. Connor was escorted away from the testing field under guard. As he passed Mason, he muttered bitterly that a mechanic could never defeat an entire industry. Mason answered coldly that he had no interest in defeating an industry. He only cared that the tank would not get innocent people killed. He turned back toward the hangar without watching Connor go, already thinking about the work still left to do. After Connor was removed from the process entirely, Mason was asked to stay on as an emergency technical advisor. He refused to take sole credit for the discovery. Instead, he insisted that Diana, Joseph, and Aiden all be listed together on the repair report. This choice revealed something essential about Mason's character. When he had been mocked and dismissed, he never sought revenge by tearing others down in return. Now that recognition finally came his way, he refused to hoard the spotlight for himself. He understood that a machine this complex needed an entire team behind it, as long as that team operated with honesty. The group began the proper repair work in earnest. They replaced the entire damaged section of signal wiring. They installed a new vibration protection housing. They swapped out the mismatched stabilization cluster for a properly certified unit. They restored the original software, free of any hidden interference. They added a cross-check warning system designed specifically to catch any future false signal before it could cause harm. They documented every single step so that other units across the Army could review and verify the same process. Hour after hour, the hangar filled with the steady rhythm of real work, wrenches turning, cables being traced, small victories logged one after another. While the work continued, Diana asked Mason why he had never mentioned his past from the very beginning. Mason answered that people who most needed to hear the truth rarely trusted an introduction. They only trusted results. Diana asked if he had felt anger at being laughed at. Mason said he had lived through far worse days than that. What truly angered him was watching people place profit ahead of a soldier's life without a second thought. The connection between Mason and Diana grew through quiet respect rather than any sudden romantic spark. There was no rush toward anything more than mutual trust, only a steady warmth building between two people who had each been tested and had each chosen honesty over convenience. Joseph told Aiden privately that Mason represented a kind of person the Army used to have plenty of, the kind too often forgotten once paperwork started to matter more than reality on the ground. After many long hours of careful work, the M1A3 stood ready for its final test. General Hayes received word from his superiors that this final demonstration would be transmitted live to the full Defense Evaluation Board. If it failed, the entire program would end for good. If it succeeded, Fort Lawson would be cleared of wrongdoing, Diana would keep her career intact, and Mason would finally receive the recognition his work deserved. The pressure returned, heavier than ever before. Mason stood alone in front of the tank for a few quiet seconds, resting his palm against the cold steel hull as though listening one final time. He told Diana softly that the machine no longer had any reason left to lie. The final test took place on the large proving ground, surrounded by Army representatives, inspectors, and engineers, with every reading streamed live back to the evaluation board. Diana coordinated the technical side of the operation while Mason stood beside the data terminal, refusing any seat of honor offered to him. General Hayes asked Mason to stand at the front for the cameras, but Mason declined, saying the tank itself was the only thing that needed to be seen today. The test was structured across 4 stages. A cold start movement across complex terrain. Turret rotation while climbing a slope. A simulated combat scenario combining heavy load with deliberate signal interference. The first stage passed cleanly. The second stage passed just as smoothly. The third stage brought real tension, since this had once been the exact point of total failure. The tank shook violently, the turret rotated, warning lights flickered across the display, yet nothing locked shut. The fourth stage proved hardest of all, since the testing system intentionally generated strong interference to see whether the tank could be fooled the same way it had been before. For a few tense seconds, a yellow warning flashed across the main screen. The crowd held its breath collectively. Mason recognized immediately that this was not a failure at all, but the new cross-check warning system functioning exactly as intended. He told Diana to continue the established procedure without deviation. Diana trusted him completely and refused to halt the test. The tank cleared the final stretch, its main gun stable, its engine steady, its drivetrain holding firm without a single lockup. The proving ground fell silent for one long beat before erupting into applause. General Hayes removed his cap, looking at Mason with genuine, unguarded respect. The evaluation board confirmed that the prototype did not need to be canceled after all. The program was saved, though the entire contractor agreement would now face a full renewed investigation. Diana walked over to Mason and told him he had saved far more than a single tank. He had saved the integrity of an entire team, and very likely the lives of future crews who would one day operate this machine in the field. Mason simply replied that he had only fixed what was broken. General Hayes publicly offered Mason a new role, lead field advisor for armored vehicle testing across the entire program. Mason hesitated, uneasy about being pulled into a world shaped by politics and power struggles. General Hayes explained that the position would let him work right there at Fort Lawson with a flexible schedule, fair pay, and most importantly, the authority to halt any test the moment he detected real danger. Mason looked at the tank, then at Diana, then at Joseph standing nearby. He understood this was not only an opportunity for himself, but a way to prevent future mistakes just like this one from ever happening again. He accepted the offer on one condition. Field reports from mechanics on the ground would carry equal weight alongside laboratory reports from the engineering office. General Hayes shook his hand in front of the entire gathered base, sealing the agreement without hesitation, while behind them the tank sat quietly in the afternoon light, finally at rest after 119 long days. A few weeks later, the full investigation report was released within internal Army channels. Connor's company lost the contract entirely, several of its leaders were placed under formal investigation, and the entire contractor inspection process was overhauled from the ground up. Diana stayed on as lead engineer, but now she built a far more transparent testing system, one that gave equal voice to field mechanics and operational technicians rather than relying solely on laboratory reports handed down from above. She often thought back to the night in the hangar, snow falling outside, and how close they had come to signing off on a lie. Aiden learned a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his career, that engineering did not live only inside computer models, but also in sound, in the smell of oil, in vibration, and in the hard-earned instincts of people who had repaired machines under real pressure. Joseph felt a quiet pride knowing he was the one who had called Mason in, though he reminded everyone that Mason had earned his own place through pure skill and nothing else. Mason did not become a loud or famous figure. He still drove his old pickup truck. He still wore his work jacket. He still spoke sparingly, choosing his words with care. But when he walked into the hangar now, nobody laughed at his oil-stained boots anymore. One quiet, gentle moment stayed with him. Mason received a short call from Grace one afternoon. He told her softly that he would be home earlier than usual that evening. There was no scene showing the child directly, only the simple call serving as a steady reminder that beneath everything else, he remained a father first. Diana noticed this small moment and understood something important. Mason's strength did not come only from his technical skill. It came from the quiet responsibility he carried with him every single day, a weight he never once complained about. General Hayes held a modest internal recognition ceremony, free of grand speeches or unnecessary spectacle. He told the assembled technical staff that the Army had spent $2 million learning a lesson Mason had proven true within 10 minutes, that nobody should ever underestimate a person who truly knows how to listen to a machine. Mason was given formal authority to halt any test the instant he identified genuine danger. This was real recognition, not a hollow gesture of thanks. Diana handed him the finalized report. The closing line read that the root cause of failure had been identified by Mason Reed, field validation specialist. Mason studied that line for a long moment. It was not the recognition itself that moved him most. It was the simple fact that after so many quiet years, his work was finally being called by its rightful name. The closing scene returned to the open proving ground, where the M1A3 rolled steadily across open terrain, strong and certain. Mason stood outside the vehicle, with no need to climb aboard, no need to wave to anyone watching, only a quiet satisfaction in seeing the machine finally operate exactly the way it was always meant to. Diana stood beside him and admitted that on the very first day she had assumed he was nothing more than a last resort. Mason offered a small, easy smile, replying that sometimes the last resort is simply the only person whose pride has not yet gotten in the way of seeing clearly. The story closed on the image of the tank moving steadily through the fading evening light, while Mason turned quietly back toward the hangar, returning to a simple life that from this day forward would never again be invisible. The Army had lost 119 days and $2 million trying to fix a single tank, yet it took only one afternoon to realize that the man everyone had laughed at was the only one calm enough and honest enough to save it. Stay with this story to the end, because the secret hidden deep inside this tank will change Mason's fate forever.